Now we have reached one of the most important comparison slides in this entire presentation. Until now, we have studied Horace alone. But to understand Horace completely, we must compare him with the three other great classical critics. Look carefully at the table. It compares four great thinkers: Plato, Aristotle, Longinus and Horace. Each of them asked the same question: what is the purpose of poetry? But each gave a different answer. By the end of this slide, you will never confuse these four critics again. Why is this comparison important? Students often memorize these names but mix up the theories. Someone remembers catharsis but writes Plato. Someone remembers sublimity but writes Aristotle. Someone remembers instruct and delight but attributes it to Longinus. This comparison helps us avoid those mistakes. Instead of memorizing isolated facts, we will understand each critic's unique philosophy. Think of these four critics as four doctors. All are trying to improve human life, but each prescribes a different medicine. Let us study them one by one. Plato, seeking the ideal. Let us begin with Plato. Look at the first row. His ultimate goal is seeking the ideal. What does this mean? Plato believed that perfect reality exists in the world of forms or ideas. Everything we see around us is only an imperfect copy. For example, there is a perfect idea of a chair, while every chair we use is only an imperfect version. According to Plato, art copies the visible world, which itself is already a copy of the ideal world. Therefore, art becomes a copy of a copy. That is why Plato did not trust poetry. Plato's view of poetry. Look at the third column. It says, dangerous and deceptive. Feeds passions instead of reason. Why did Plato think poetry was dangerous? Because poetry affects emotions. When people watch tragedies, they cry, become angry, or feel intense emotions. Plato feared that these emotions weaken reason. He believed reason should control our lives. Anything that weakens reason could become harmful. Therefore, Plato wanted poetry to be strictly controlled. Some poets were even excluded from his ideal republic. Simple example. Imagine a doctor telling a patient, avoid eating too much sugar because it is unhealthy. Plato treats emotions almost like that. Too much emotional excitement, according to Plato, can damage rational thinking. Therefore, he was suspicious of poetry. Aristotle, catharsis. Now let us move to Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's student, but surprisingly, he disagreed with his teacher. Look at the second row. His ultimate goal is catharsis. Catharsis means emotional purification or cleansing. Unlike Plato, Aristotle believed emotions are not enemies. They are natural. Instead of suppressing emotions, literature helps us experience them safely. Understanding catharsis. Suppose you watch a tragic film. You cry, you feel pity, you experience fear. After the movie ends, you strangely feel lighter. Your emotions have been released. This emotional cleansing is called catharsis. According to Aristotle, this is one of the greatest benefits of tragedy. Therefore, poetry is not dangerous. It is actually psychologically healthy. Plato versus Aristotle. Notice the difference. Plato says, poetry makes emotions stronger. Aristotle replies, yes, but after experiencing them, people become emotionally balanced. That is the fundamental difference between these two philosophers. Longinus, sublimity. Now let us move to Longinus. Look at the third row. His ultimate goal is sublimity. This is another unique idea. Longinus believed that great literature should not merely teach. It should not merely purify emotions. Instead, it should elevate the reader. It should fill the mind with wonder, awe, and greatness. Understanding the sublime. Imagine standing before the Himalayas, or watching a powerful thunderstorm, or looking into a sky filled with millions of stars. For a moment, you forget yourself. You feel amazed, speechless, inspired. This overwhelming experience is called the sublime. Longinus believed that great poetry should create exactly this feeling. Longinus's view of poetry. Look at the third column. It says, transports the reader through grand thought and passion. Notice the word transports. Great literature lifts us beyond ordinary life. It takes us to a higher emotional and intellectual level. According to Longinus, that is the highest achievement of poetry. Horace, instruct and delight. Now we come to Horace. Look at the last row. His ultimate goal is instruct and delight. By now, this should sound familiar. We have already studied this principle in detail. Horace believed poetry should perform two tasks at the same time. It should teach useful lessons, and it should provide pleasure. Neither teaching alone, nor entertainment alone, is enough. Both must work together. Horace's view of poetry. Look at the third column. It says, creates beauty to teach moral and practical lessons and please the soul. Notice how balanced Horace is. Unlike Plato, he does not reject poetry. Unlike Aristotle, he does not focus mainly on emotional cleansing. Unlike Longinus, he does not focus mainly on overwhelming greatness. Instead, Horace asks, what practical benefit does literature provide? His answer is simple. It teaches wisdom. It shapes character. It delights readers. It improves society. An easy way to remember. Let us create a simple memory trick. Think of 4 different teachers. Plato says, be careful. Poetry can mislead you. Aristotle says, poetry heals your emotions. Longinus says, poetry lifts your soul. Horace says, poetry teaches you while giving you pleasure. 1 sentence for each critic. This makes them much easier to remember. Comparison table in simple words. Let us compare all 4 together. Plato asks, is poetry safe? His answer, not always. It can deceive people. Aristotle asks, what does poetry do to our emotions? His answer, it purifies them. Longinus asks, how does poetry make us feel? His answer, it fills us with awe and greatness. Horace asks, what should poetry accomplish? His answer, it should teach us and delight us simultaneously. Examination tip. In competitive examinations, questions often ask, match the critic with the correct concept. Remember this order: Plato, idealism and suspicion of poetry; Aristotle, catharsis; Longinus, sublimity; Horace, instruct and delight; Utile et Dulce. If you remember these 4 keywords, you can answer many objective questions correctly. Why Horace is different. One interesting observation is that Horace is perhaps the most practical of these critics. Plato mainly discusses philosophy. Aristotle mainly analyzes tragedy. Longinus mainly explains literary greatness. Horace, however, gives practical advice directly to writers. He teaches them how to choose subjects, how to revise, how to write plays, how to develop style, how to educate readers, and how to become responsible artists. That practical approach explains why Ars Poetica remained a handbook for writers for nearly 2,000 years. Let us quickly summarize the comparison. Plato believed poetry could be dangerous because it excites emotions and moves people away from reason. Aristotle believed poetry is beneficial because it produces catharsis, cleansing emotions through pity and fear. Longinus believed the highest purpose of literature is sublimity, creating awe through grand thought and powerful expression. Horace believed the best poetry combines instruction with delight, teaching moral and practical wisdom while giving readers aesthetic pleasure. This comparison clearly shows that although all 4 thinkers studied poetry, each understood its purpose in a unique and influential way. Now we come to one of the most important comparison slides in the entire presentation. This slide explains how the meaning of one important literary concept changed over time. That concept is called mimesis. The word mimesis comes from the Greek language and simply means imitation. At first, this seems like a very easy word, but immediately a question arises. Imitation of what? Should literature imitate nature? Should it imitate reality? Should it imitate great writers? Should it simply copy what already exists? 3 great critics answered these questions in 3 completely different ways. That is exactly what this slide explains. Notice the arrows connecting the 3 boxes. They show that literary criticism did not remain the same. It evolved. One thinker responded to another. Each critic developed the idea further. So, let us understand this journey step by step. First stage. Plato's view. Let us begin with Plato. Look at the first box. It says, a copy of a copy. This is probably Plato's most famous criticism of poetry. To understand this, we must first understand Plato's philosophy. Plato believed that there are three levels of reality. The first level is the world of forms or world of ideas. According to Plato, this is the perfect world. Everything there is eternal, perfect, and unchanging. For example, there is a perfect idea of a chair. There is a perfect idea of beauty. There is a perfect idea of justice. These perfect forms are the highest reality. The second level is our physical world. The chair we sit on, the trees we see, the houses we live in, all these are imperfect copies of the perfect forms. Now comes the third level. Suppose an artist paints the chair, or a poet describes the chair. The painting is not the real chair. It is only an image of the chair. Since the chair itself is already an imperfect copy of the perfect form, the painting becomes a copy of a copy. That is why Plato says art is far removed from truth. Why does Plato reject mimesis? Look at the second point. It says, negative, deceptive mimicry of physical reality. Plato believed that art creates appearances, not truth. A painting may look like a horse, but it cannot run. A poem may describe courage, but it is not courage itself. Therefore, art can easily deceive people. It may make imagination appear more important than truth. Plato feared that poetry could excite emotions, weaken reason, and mislead society. That is why he viewed imitation negatively. A simple example. Imagine looking into a mirror. You see your reflection. The reflection looks exactly like you. But can it speak? Can it think? Can it help you? No. It is only an image. Plato believed art is similar. It reflects reality, but it is not reality itself. Therefore, he considered imitation unreliable. Second stage. Aristotle's view. Now let us move to Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's student. However, he completely changed his teacher's understanding of imitation. Look at the second box. It says, a natural intellectual instinct to learn. This is a revolutionary idea. Aristotle asks a very simple question. How do children learn? They learn by imitation. A child learns to speak by copying parents. A student learns by observing teachers. An apprentice learns by watching a master. Therefore, imitation is not something harmful. It is a natural part of human learning. Instead of criticizing imitation, Aristotle praises it. Literature does more than copy. Aristotle says literature does not merely copy individual events. Instead, it represents universal truths. What does that mean? History tells us what happened to one particular person. Literature tells us what can happen to any human being. That is why Aristotle believed poetry is often more philosophical than history. For example, many people have never been princes like Hamlet. But almost everyone has experienced confusion, indecision, grief, or self-doubt. Therefore, Hamlet represents universal human experience. This is what Aristotle means by imitation. It is not copying, it is revealing deeper truths about human life. Plato and Aristotle compared. Notice the difference between these two philosophers. Plato says, poetry copies appearances and moves us away from truth. Aristotle replies, poetry reveals universal truths and helps us understand life. Both use the same word, mimesis, but they give it completely different meanings. This is why Aristotle is considered a turning point in literary criticism. Third stage, Horace's shift. Now let us move to the third box. Here, Horace changes the discussion again. Look at the definition. It says, imitating other great writers, not just nature. This is a practical approach. Horace is less interested in debating whether imitation is good or bad. Instead, he asks, how does a poet become great? His answer is simple. Study the greatest writers. Read Homer. Read Sophocles. Read Euripides. Observe how they construct plots. Observe how they develop characters. Observe how they choose words. Then learn from them. Does Horace encourage copying? This is a very important question. No. Horace does not encourage blind copying. There is a huge difference between copying and creative imitation. Copying means repeating another person's work exactly. Creative imitation means learning principles, techniques, and artistic skills, then creating something original. That is exactly what Horace recommends. He wants young poets to learn from masters, not become their duplicates. A simple modern example. Think about learning music. A beginner first sings famous songs. The student carefully studies rhythm, melody, and pronunciation. Later, after gaining experience, the musician begins composing original songs. Nobody criticizes this process. It is how learning happens. Horace believed writing develops in exactly the same way. Great writers become our teachers. Another example. Imagine an architecture student. Before designing a new building, the student studies famous structures around the world. The student learns why they are beautiful, why they are strong, and why they have lasted for centuries. After learning these principles, the student designs something completely new. This is Horace's idea of imitation. Learn first, create later. Horace's practical philosophy. Look at the last statement. It says, creatively adapting the works of Greek masters is the path to excellence. Notice the phrase, creatively adapting. Horace admired Greek literature. He believed Roman poets should study Greek masterpieces. But they should never become mere copyists. Instead, they should adapt those ideas, improve them, and create works suitable for Roman society. This practical approach later influenced Renaissance writers, neoclassical critics, and many modern authors. The evolution of mimesis. Now let us connect all three thinkers. First comes Plato. For Plato, imitation is dangerous because it moves us away from truth. Next comes Aristotle. For Aristotle, imitation is natural because it helps us understand universal human life. Finally comes Horace. For Horace, the question is no longer, should we imitate? Instead, he asks, whom should we imitate? His answer is, the greatest writers. This is why the slide is called The Evolution of Mimesis. The same word remains, but its meaning develops from one thinker to another. Here is an easy way to remember these three critics. Plato says, imitation deceives. Aristotle says, imitation teaches. Horace says, imitation trains. Just remember these three verbs. They summarize the entire evolution of mimesis. In competitive examinations, you may find questions such as, who considered imitation a copy of a copy? The answer is Plato. Who described imitation as a natural instinct to learn? The answer is Aristotle. Who encouraged poets to imitate and creatively adapt the works of great writers? The answer is Horace. Remembering these three key ideas will help you answer many objective questions correctly. Let us quickly summarize this slide. Plato viewed mimesis negatively, believing that art is only a copy of a copy and therefore moves people away from truth. Aristotle transformed the idea by arguing that imitation is a natural human instinct through which literature represents universal truths and helps people learn. Horace gave mimesis a practical direction by encouraging poets to study, imitate, and creatively adapt the works of great masters, making imitation a method of artistic training rather than mere copying. This slide shows that literary criticism evolved from philosophical suspicion to psychological understanding, and finally to practical artistic guidance.